The United States of America has radically changed its strategy in the war with Iran, this time focusing on global economic pressure not only on Tehran, but also on all its allies. US President Donald Trump announced the beginning of what he called a devastating economic campaign against Iran because of Tehran's unwillingness to sign a peace agreement with Washington. Trump himself immediately warned all countries that might want to help Iran survive this blockade that they would be subjected to economic pressure from Washington. At the same time, the US Secretary of the Treasury stated that the United States is preparing for the largest and most coordinated economic isolation of Iran in world history. In Iran, the US threat was taken quite seriously. The Iranian Ministry of Foreign Affairs issued a statement in which it called the devastating economic campaign announced by Trump, aimed at isolating Iran, an act of terrorism and a crime against humanity, stating that the sanctions against Iran are not aimed at the regime, but at ordinary Iranians. But now the question arises, will Donald Trump be able to see it through to the end, or will it once again be limited to just threats? Let's figure it out together now. But before we move on to the discussion, I would like to note that the US military has quietly created a shipping corridor through the Strait of Hormuz in both directions for the daily transportation of millions of barrels of oil. That's why the US can afford a prolonged operation against Iran. My name is Alexey Pichi. Let's discuss this topic together. But before that, I ask you to subscribe to the channel, like this episode, and be sure to write any question you have in the comments. So, the President of the United States of America, Donald Trump, announced the start of what he called a devastating economic campaign against Iran due to Tehran's unwillingness to sign a peace agreement with Washington. Next is a quote from the American president. "No one has given the Islamic Republic of Iran more opportunities to make a deal than I have. Unfortunately for them, they did not take advantage of it. Therefore, today I am announcing the most devastating economic operation and ever undertaken against any country." Trump emphasized that this will be an economic war and isolation of unprecedented scale. He also warned that any country that allows its financial institutions, businesses or government agencies to support Iran will itself face, quote, "colossal economic consequences." Oil smuggling, swap lines, money transfers, exchange offices, ship registries, shell companies, all of this must stop immediately, said Donald Trump. The president called on American allies to help isolate and defeat the Iranian threat. And once again, he promised that Tehran would never have nuclear weapons. At the same time, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent stated that the United States is preparing for the largest, with coordinated economic isolation of Iran in world history. He says the world has never seen anything like this before. The head of the US Treasury also urged allies to make a choice. Either they act together with the United States or against them. In particular, Bessent stated that if allies or other countries continue to do business with Tehran, transfer money to them, buy Iranian oil or carry out maritime shipments, the Treasury and the US Embassy will immediately use all their power and strength to ensure compliance with the measures imposed against them. And it's important to note here that Donald Trump has a tool for this kind of pressure. Because, let me remind you, the day before, the Senate had already passed a bill by the late Senator Lindsey Graham, which was aimed at sanction pressure against Russia. That very Sanctions from Hell bill. But at the last moment, Iran was also added to this bill, so that these same measures could be used by Donald Trump against Iran. The point is that the US can impose 100% tariffs against any country that in any way helps the Iranian regime survive. Earlier, CNN sources among American officials reported that Donald Trump ordered to stop any negotiations with Iran due to Tehran's unwillingness to make concessions. According to them, in the president's administration, they abandoned attempts, quote, to crush Iran as soon as possible and decided to strangle it with economic measures. US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent added that Washington is preparing unprecedented pressure on Tehran, which will be aimed at restricting trade with the Islamic Republic and may affect buyers of Iranian oil. Here, of course, the question arises, who exactly is buying this Iranian oil? And now Reuters reports that the most likely way to increase pressure on Iran is to impose sanctions against Chinese oil refineries and banks that are still working with Iranian oil suppliers. However, such a move could lead to retaliatory measures from Beijing and impact the global energy market. At the same time, in Iran, they commented on Trump's declaration of economic war against their country. The Iranian Ministry of Foreign Affairs issued a statement in which they called Trump's declared devastating economic operation aimed at isolating Iran an act of terrorism and a crime against humanity. So, the regime in Iran, which killed tens of thousands of people during protests, is now saying that this is a crime against humanity. Well, let me quote an official statement from the Iranian Foreign Ministry. The US economic sanctions against Iran aimed at the fundamental rights of every Iranian citizen, they remember the citizens, are an act of economic terrorism and a crime against humanity. And those who order the imposition of these sanctions and carry them out for committing such heinous crimes must be brought to justice and held accountable. Sanctions and economic pressure are just the other side of the same coin as military aggression. The United States' unhealthy dependence on these two tools not only creates a real threat to international peace and security, but has also brought human civilization to an unprecedented moral decline. Sorry, I can't hold back when I read such statements from the Iranian Foreign Ministry. They remind me, they're like Russians. Russians too, when they start getting punched in the face, Russians start remembering international law, humanity, about human rights, about international security measures, and so on. But when they wage war themselves, they forget all of that. And I'll just remind you that Iran for years, even for decades, not only destabilized the region itself, but also financed and armed Hezbollah in Lebanon so that it would fight against Israel. The so-called Axis of Resistance in Iraq, the Houthis in Yemen, and even partly Hamas in the Gaza Strip. And essentially, they were funding terrorism in the region. Now they've finally woken up. But still, it should be admitted that this threat scared Iran, because the regime in Tehran knows that the situation in the Strait of Hormuz has indeed changed. Axios reports that the US military has quietly created a shipping corridor through the Strait of Hormuz in both directions for the daily transportation of millions of barrels of oil. As reported, as part of the operation that has been underway for several weeks, every night, 15 to 20 tankers enter and exit the strait through the southern channel along the coast of Oman. According to officials, about 10 million barrels of oil are transported from the strait every day. This is about half of the pre-war volume. This situation is one of the most painful aspects of this war, namely disruptions in oil supplies that have led to a sharp increase in crude oil prices. Although the volume of oil exported from the strait is still below pre-war levels, it has a noticeable impact on global supplies. And now a task force led by the US military is coordinating its actions with regional partners in the Persian Gulf countries. It compiles a daily list of ships leaving the Persian Gulf through the Strait of Hormuz into the Arabian Sea, as well as a list of chartered empty tankers that are traveling from the Arabian Sea through the Strait of Hormuz to the ports of the Persian Gulf countries to replenish their oil supplies. Every night, these ships travel along one major route during a specific time window, and along one major route in the opposite direction during another time window, so that the American military has enough resources to provide escort both ways. It is reported that the operation became possible thanks to a recent two-week military campaign by the US Central Command, during which Iranian radar and maritime surveillance systems were disabled. And now Iran simply can't see all the passing ships, meaning the radars are no longer sufficient, and accordingly, it's possible to hide these ships. And against this backdrop, Trump announced that the US is no longer negotiating with Iran, since the threat in the Strait has been minimized, although it still remains to some extent. But still, it's important to understand that Donald Trump's new strategy of economic strangulation has its flaws. It will take months or even years to destroy the Iranian economy. This will require strategic patience, which Trump almost never shows. Iran would not be alone in assuming that Trump will get tired of his new plan long before it starts to bring results. But now Trump is expecting a visit to the US from Chinese leader Xi Jinping, with whom he may, well, apparently, try to coordinate pressure on Iran, possibly by threatening new sanctions. For example, one effective step would be to impose sanctions against Chinese banks involved in operations related to the illegal sale of Iranian oil. But Trump will receive President Xi Jinping of China for a state visit, if I'm not mistaken, on September 23. This is one of the main events of the year for the American president, so it would be a big surprise if Trump spoiled the atmosphere by imposing some sanctions against China before that time, before Xi Jinping's visit. But even if Trump is ready to wait until his economic war puts pressure on Iran, there's another factor. Tehran can fight back, not economically, but militarily. Look, here's what's important. Donald Trump, by declaring an economic war, is counting on the fact that the hot phase of the war, with missile launches, shelling and so on, will be paused. Well, or at the very least it will die down. In other words, we won't be witnessing the hot phase of the war, and during this time, according to his plan, the US will be putting maximum pressure on Iran. But Iran has strong political reasons to refuse, Donald Trump, a chance to quiet things down during the fall election campaign in the US. Moreover, Iran has a geopolitical incentive to escalate, to preserve its main military achievement, the ability to slow down the movement of ships passing through the Strait of Hormuz. New drone or missile strikes on ships will increase economic costs for American voters and remind them that the war is not actually over. That the fact that Trump is moving from the hot phase of the war to an economic war. This does not mean that the other side, that is, the opponent, also stops shelling altogether. Let me remind you that earlier Iran already hinted that it is even ready to try to strike European bases, or more precisely, American bases in Eastern Europe. So here, the strategy certainly looks appealing. According to Trump's plan, it should finally choke off the Iranian regime, but on the other hand, we must not forget that the Iranian regime has been under sanctions for almost 50 years. So whatever new Trump comes up with here, time will tell. I'll leave it at that. Your opinion, your conclusions. Write in the comments under this episode, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. If you want to support the work of this YouTube channel, you can do so financially with any donation using the links and details in the description of this video. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Bye everyone!